Hey everyone, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the humerus. So the humerus is broken up into three regions, and that's how we're going to cover the structures to break it up a little bit. So this first region up here is the proximal end, and that's where we'll start. Then we have the shaft, and then we have the distal end. So let's go ahead and start with the proximal end. The first structure is the head of the humerus. The head of the humerus is oriented in an upward medial posterior direction. So it points up, in, and back slightly. Let's go ahead and we'll put a mark around it. There it is, the humeral head, which connects to the glenoid fossa on the scapula. Just below the head, we have what's called the anatomical neck. Now, the reason this is called the anatomical neck instead of just the neck is that there's another neck that we talk about, which is right here, called the surgical neck. The idea being that this is the true neck in terms of the way we name necks in anatomy. It's the thinner structure just below the head, just like our own neck. But we call this a surgical neck due to that being potentially where a prosthesis would be inserted in a shoulder replacement. So we have the anatomical and surgical necks. The next structure is the greater tuberosity. It used to be called the greater tubercle. I see tuberosity used much more frequently now. It's actually quite big. It's not just this region, as I've seen it labeled before. It's actually this entire area right here. And the reason I know that is because it has three facets here that we'll go ahead and label if we can find them. They can be quite clear on the real bone. This looks pretty good. The superior I'm having a little trouble with, but let's go ahead and label them. Here's the superior facet, the middle facet, and then I'm going to have to rotate it a little bit, the inferior facet. So inferior, middle, superior. And so if we look at the greater tuberosity, it's kind of shaped like this. And so we're talking about the superior, middle, and inferior facet. Those are all muscle insertions. Let's see if we can bring in muscles. There we go. So you see three muscle attachments to the greater tuberosity: supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. And those attach to those facets, superior, middle, and inferior. Let's rotate here, and we can see the lesser tuberosity. It is quite a bit smaller. And then in between the two tuberosities, we have what's called the IT groove. That used to stand for intertubercular groove. Now that we refer to these as tuberosities, it's the intertuberocular groove, or my personal favorite because it's easy to say, the bicipital groove. So it's this groove right here between the two tuberosities is called the bicipital groove. And that groove is made up of the, let's see here, the crest of the greater tuberosity, which is the lateral lip of the groove, and the crest of the lesser tuberosity, which is the medial lip of the groove. Anyway, this whole area together is considered the bicipital groove. And that's it for the proximal end. So let's go ahead and take a look at the shaft. Now, the first thing we should probably address are the borders and surfaces. So this is going to be somewhat tough to do, potentially. Let's look at it. As you start to look at the shaft, the region between the two epiphyses, you might start to notice it kind of looks like a triangular prism a bit. If we were to take a slice, if we were to come in here and take a slice, cut it in half, and then look at it from a superior view, what we would see is a triangle like this with a point facing forward, facing anteriorly. So we're going to call that point facing forward the anterior border. Okay, and if we were going to draw that on the humerus, it'd be right there. Now we would call this point the point pointing away from the body, because remember the humeral head is pointing towards the body. So the point pointing away from the body would be the lateral border, and the point pointing towards the body, or towards your body's midline rather, is the medial border. So it would be lateral border, and you can't quite see the medial border, but you sort of can. So if this is the anterior border, this here would be posterior, but this isn't a border, it's a flat surface. So we're going to call that the posterior surface. Now let's look opposite the medial border. So this would be lateral, but again, it's not a border, it's a surface. So we'll call that lateral surface, and then medial surface. So those are the three borders and three surfaces of the humerus. Now if we're going to look at the humerus again, this one here, facing anteriorly, is the, let's see if we can write it AB, is the anterior border. This is the lateral border. This is the medial border. We can't see the posterior surface in this view, but we can see the lateral surface and the medial surface. Okay, let's get rid of all this and just take a look. So you can kind of see those three surfaces and three borders. All right, so that's borders and surfaces of the humerus. There are some structures on the shaft itself besides just those borders. So the first one is a deltoid tuberosity. Now, again, it's not amazing on here. It's all, I mean, to be honest, it's difficult to see on a real bone in some cases. It just depends on what that particular person's bone markings look like, how much stress were on their bones. But that's it. One thing that might be helpful is to bring in the deltoid. So there's the deltoid insertion. So as we remove that, we can kind of picture that the deltoid tuberosity would be right there. All right, now let's take a look at the supracondylar ridges. So these two structures here are the condyles, and then these structures, they're not labeled unfortunately, but right here and right here, those are epicondyles. These let me get rid of this muscle. The regions directly above the epicondyles are called supracondylar ridges, which makes sense because they're above the condyles. So this would be the lateral supracondylar ridge, and this would be the medial supracondylar ridge. And that brings us to our distal end. So just this very end, there's some structures to name. Now, if we kind of do a spin here, we can see that there are some fossa. So here's a fossa in the back, and a fossa, two fossae actually in the front. So we're going to start off by this one in the back. Now, there's a structure on our ulna, which I'll add back in here, called our olecranon. This big hook-looking thing is our olecranon process. Now that hooks into our olecranon fossa on our humerus, right here. So you can imagine when our forearm is extended, it's pretty stable because it's actually hooked into the back of your humerus. So next time you're carrying a lot of groceries, you can picture that hooked into your humerus there. That's the olecranon fossa. In the front, we have a similar thing going on, except when the arm's extended like this, sorry, when the forearm's extended like this, you can't actually see these structures fitting in their fossa. But if you imagined flexing, bending your elbow and flexing it, this structure here, which is called the coronoid process, would actually insert into this fossa here, which is called the coronoid fossa. The same is true for the head of the radius. If you were to bend your elbow, the head of the radius would sit right in here, which is called the radial fossa. So quick recap, we have the radial fossa here, the coronoid fossa there, and on the back we have the olecranon fossa. Well, actually the olecranon's in place, so we can see where it would be. It's this whole area, olecranon fossa. That brings us to a few of our last structures here. So we have what's called the capitulum. Capitate means a head. That's where the word decapitate comes from. Capitate means head. And this looked like a head to someone, so it's called capitate. Another name for it is the lateral condyle. And right next to the lateral condyle is the medial condyle right here, which is called the trochlea, because it looks like a spool of thread, and trochlea means spool. So those are your two condyles. Now we also have epicondyles. A lot of muscles attached to our epicondyles. So here's our medial epicondyle and our lateral epicondyle. That's lateral. That's medial. And then the last structure on our list is you're probably familiar with because you've accidentally hit it on a table or a door frame or something, is right here, this groove. Now this is a groove for our ulnar nerve, and when you hit your ulnar nerve, your pinky and half your ring finger kind of tingle, and that's what we call our funny bone. We kind of put pressure on our ulnar nerve against this ulnar groove. So this structure is called the ulnar groove. Before we wrap up here, let's see if we can add nerves in. Oops. Okay, there we go. So they're saying that's our ulnar nerve right there, going through the ulnar groove. And that's it, everybody. That is the humerus. Thank you.